Hello, my name is Raylene Drong. I'm the Dean of College Arts and Letters. It's my honor and my pleasure to welcome you to our Arts and Humanity in the Age of Pandemic dialogic presentation. This is the first presentation of this year's Cal Talk series, which feature various topics that concern all of us. I would like to thank our speakers and facilitator for graciously agreeing to share their insight with us. I would also like to thank our audience for joining our very lively discussion on arts and humanity in the pandemic. I also like to express my sincere appreciation for ITS team and specifically Dean Lee for setting up the webinar for us, and also David Brady and Diana De La Cruz for helping us promote these events and also troubleshooting for us. This panel brings together 8 faculty from departments in our college to discuss pandemic zeitgeist, which means the spirit of time, and what it means for disciplines across the arts and humanities. Specifically, Professor Matthew Poole, Chair of Department of Arts and Design, will address what we might learn from current situation and how art and public discourse might have to change. Dr. Shafiq Rahman, Chair of Communication Studies, will explore the concept and evolution of so-called news, especially focusing on degradation of news as a social commodity and the need for disseminating accurate information to fight COVID-19 and pandemic. Dr. Dave Carlson, Chair of English Department, will summarize the novel I Am Legend, a book which focuses on a global pandemic that turned most of the human population into vampires, and use the book to exemplify literary texts like I Am Legend can provide intellectual and emotional resources for confronting our present situation. Dr. Stacey Fraser will present Ether, a multimedia work by critically acclaimed and Grammy-winning composer Jack Van Dyne. She will use Ether as an example to demonstrate a completely new and audience experience in the midst of the pandemic. Dr. William Vanderburg from the Philosophy Department will discuss the ethics of public health orders and the meaning of life in the context of the impending collapse of civilization. Dr. Terry Smith will produce and provide a glancing look at the innovation, creativity, and necessity of pandemic performance. Dr. George Thomas, Chair of World Language and Literature, will draw a connection between social isolation associated with current COVID pandemic and the convent and monastic life. The writing of many 16th and 17th century nuns and friars offer us idea about how to benefit from social distancing. Finally, the last but not least, Professor Kelly Dortch, Coordinator of Liberal Study, will discuss community engagement with the community during the age of pandemic. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Parastu Faith Aringalam, our Golden Apple Award winner and our Associate Dean, who will introduce each speaker and serve as our facilitator for today's panel presentation. Dr. Parastu.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. As Dean Chong noted, I will be facilitating our conversation today and introducing the panelists briefly. So the first speaker, Matthew Poole, is a professor and chair of the Department of Art and Design. Professor Poole writes about modern and contemporary art and has curated various exhibitions and given talks at museums and galleries across the world. The core of his work is to explore political and socioeconomic ramifications of both the production and reception of art. Professor Poole.
Okay, thanks so much. I apologize in advance. I'm going to have to talk really, really quickly. I don't like to do this, but I've written about 3.5 pages and I can just about get it into 8 minutes. So I'll do my best. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about how my discipline, museology, has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic's effect on society. But ultimately, I want to try to find some positive aspects of the current situation, or for future similar situations, for my discipline and also for society more broadly. And for this, I'll talk a little bit about the public sphere. To begin with, we can say that the ways in which the current situation have affected the reception of exhibited art or design works are quite obvious. As you can imagine, attendance at galleries and museums has plummeted around the world as many art and design institutions have closed their doors, in my opinion quite rightly, to protect their audiences from exposure to the virus by restricting people. And of course, audiences are staying away, again, in my opinion, quite rightly, to protect themselves and others by not interacting with others in physical space unnecessarily. So that's all fairly straightforward. And it is, of course, bad news for art and design, because the fine arts, visual art, contemporary art and design, are as much social and discursive as they are aesthetic and phenomenal. In other words, as much as it is important for people to see and be present with actual artworks or objects of design in actual exhibitions, it's equally important that such exhibitions catalyze and actively propagate discussion about the works and the issues, ideas, concepts, histories, arguments and theories that are as much a constitutive part of the works themselves as the mediums of which the works are physically constituted. Also, unless art and design works are exhibited, i.e. made public, they're not available for reception by audiences and hence cannot be part of the discursive ecology of the arts and humanities. So what's really at stake in a situation such as the current one we're living through now is the diminishment of discursive context, in my case, for art and design. Now, you might say that digital electronic communication technologies can fill the gap that's left. Social media, websites, YouTube, Zoom, virtual reality, and so on. And to some extent, they can. Obviously, for works that require some phenomenal corporeal interaction of the human body with the work itself, and I'm thinking here of works like those of Richard Serra particularly, that's not possible. But equally importantly, the congregation of people, of bodies, to engage in discussion is severely limited. And we have to ask what is lost when our discussions and communications are limited, like right now, to a tiny window on an electronic screen. Furthermore, the platforms, the software, the whole infrastructure that allows for our Zooming or Skyping or Instagramming, etc., is all privately owned. And as such, there are restrictions in place that are controlled by private interests, i.e. the companies, the corporations, that own these channels of communication, which brings its own problems for the autonomy, freedom, and spontaneity of discursive activity. So I don't want to romanticize or simplify the public sphere in opposition to the private sphere. It too, the public sphere that is subject to restrictions and controls as well, of course. However, we can posit at least that the public sphere has some measure of connection to democratic governance greater than that of the private sphere of companies, etc. In the art world, especially the contemporary art world, the exhibitionary and discursive spaces of art reception have been overtaken and taken over by private interests in the past 25 years to an extent not seen since the French Revolution, where art was liberated to some extent from the exclusive private interests of the European aristocratic class. Not just the mega economy of the commercial art market, but also the private interests involved in and influencing heavily public art institutions such as museums. It's been nearly 30 years since Rosalind Krauss wrote the seminal essay, The Cultural Logic of the Late Capitalist Museum, in which she castigates various museums, but especially Mass MoCA in Boston, for financializing their collections of art as leverage for massive loans to rapidly expand their property holdings in massive physical expansion of the museum spaces, in a manner that turned the collection and exhibitions into a capitalist spectacle, thus radically transforming the mission and the function of the museum as an institution of art, but also radically changing the function of the public spaces of the museum at the same time. Such changes to museums have continued unabated over the past 30 years, to the extent that museums and museums of contemporary art especially are now far more considered as destinations for leisure and lifestyle promotion, i.e. they've become Instagram backgrounds, than they are for complex, nuanced, productive and meaningful discursive activity. Now, I point to museums in this way to signal them as a microcosm of spaces of the social, of the public, although it's important not to conflate those two terms, because they are paradigmatic of what has happened and continues to happen in the transformation of all the many different spaces, places, institutions, organization, groups, and so on, that we might consider public. If you've read Hannah Arendt's 1958 book, The Human Condition, you'll know that she famously describes the public sphere as where we are seen and heard by others. And this seeing and hearing and being seen and being heard constitutes our reality together as a shared experience. Jürgen Habermas, in his 1962 book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, expounds on this to show the complexities, nuances, and overlapping of the various subspheres or elements that make up the public sphere, and demonstrates how these are constructed and how these have changed with the advent of a bourgeois public from the 11th century to the present, where cities and their various different spaces have been transformed by the increasingly principal focus of social life becoming and Nan's 1892 book, Rethinking the Public Sphere, a contribution to the critique of actually existing democracy, critiquing Arendt and Habermas's reliance on Greco-Roman models or precedents of the public that largely ignore the fact that slaves and women were not enfranchised to be part of the public sphere. And this demonstrates the need for a rethinking and a reworking of the public sphere to include what she describes as subaltern publics, marginalized, invisible, voiceless, uncounted, or otherwise disenfranchised groups in society who cannot fully participate in the public sphere and all many intersecting mechanisms without the rights and protections, not to mention the satisfaction of being fully present in society and feeling and executing agency in society that come from these. Henri Lefebvre's writings, such as in his books Right to the City, 1968, Production of Space, 74, and The Critique of Everyday Life, 77, show us that there is a symbiotic relationship, both a correlation and a force of causation, between all of the constitutive parts of what the public sphere is or could be, literal physical spaces, public institutions, the conceptualization of the public, and the operations, effects, and possibilities of public life. His work shows us that all of the elements that we can conceive of as public intersect in dynamic and interdependent ways, like an ecology, where the concrete realities of the publicness of the public sphere are equally as important as the ideas and concepts that constitute it at a theoretical, legal, or ideological level, and that they all rely upon and change one another as in a rhizome. So the main point I want to make is that there are some positive aspects of the current tragic and painful situation under COVID-19. What the current situation shows us is that it is possible for the nature of the public sphere rapidly and significantly. Although I recognize that not everyone has respected or taken seriously the safety measures needed at the current time, the vast majority of people across the world have. And the time spent during this new experience of communication and communing remotely is time that we can spend reflecting on and planning ways in which we can improve the public sphere, not least to make it more inclusive and equitable. The brave public protests for the Black Lives Matter movement now and the courageous protests for the Me Too movement before COVID-19 attest to some very important shortcuts in public life in general. These and many other good causes to support should have an impact on the public sphere. They should be changing all of the elements of the public sphere, but as yet, sadly, they have not or are not because of some very deeply endemic structural problems with the way that the public sphere is constituted. We have to ask why are public protests routinely and roundly discouraged, marginalized, and ignored? The current mechanisms that have changed the concrete aspects of the public sphere are clearly only partially adequate to the needs of a complex society. For example, not everyone has access to the internet or to powerful enough computers to take part in this virtual public sphere adequately or if at all. And also we need to ask, Do we lose the full metaphysics of presence afforded by a physically present corporeal public sphere, i.e. the town square, the agora, the street, etc., places of assembly and congregation? But again, I don't want to over-romanticize or simplify the question of the metaphysics of presence as a required necessity for interaction in and with the public sphere, but it is an interesting question to ask. What could adequately replace, replicate, or supplement it in these certain extreme circumstances like today? Also, whilst the current situation is largely driven by fear for our individual and collective safety, we can take hope from the fact that such a change of the public sphere has taken effect quickly and significantly and at a large scale out of positive and care-driven sentiment and reasoning. This gives hope that the public sphere can continue to be changed on similar grounds, but to different ends, i.e. to include groups that are so clearly and obviously hidden or marginalized. And finally, whilst museums and galleries are only one very small part of this complex matrix of the public sphere, they can play a significant role as test beds, as experimental spaces, places, and institutions, and exemplars of what the public sphere can do to, as Claire Bishop writes in her 2013 book, Radical Museology, offer a more politicized engagement with our historical moment, to question and raise consciousness, rather than merely consolidating private prestige. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Poole. Just a quick note before we proceed, as for our audience, you can type in your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, and if you have any comments, you can also communicate your comments with the panelists in the chat section. Thank you, Professor Poole. So our next speaker is Dr. Shafiq Rahman. He is professor and chair of communication studies. Dr. Rahman's teaching and research focus on international communication, global diaspora, intercultural communication, communication theory, and research methods. He has published a book and multiple articles on the identity and media use of Bangladeshi diaspora in the United States. So, Professor Rahman.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you and your family are staying safe during this pandemic. As you know, this COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted our life and caused us either to put a pause on our life and career or forced us to get things done in an alternative way. This pandemic also gave us time to reflect on our life and figure out what is important and what is not. Today, I will talk about a mundane thing in our life, news. I will argue that the crisis of COVID-19 pandemic has been compounded by another crisis, the degradation of news that has been going on for a long time in the United States and basically throughout the world. The effect of what I'm calling badly damaged news has made it even more difficult to fight this pandemic. News plays a significant role in our personal and social life. Perhaps some of us still ruminate the time when we used to begin our days by skimming the headlines of our favorite newspaper with our morning coffee. Consuming news was a daily family ritual during the golden days of television, when the whole family would watch network television news as they would eat their supper. News is critical for building our social capital so that we can engage with others meaningfully and perform our responsibilities as citizens. In Western liberal democracies, the press is usually dubbed as the fourth estate, which ideally should play a critical role to ensure transparency and accountability in governance. However, over the years, the institutions that provide news lost credibility. A Pew Research Center survey recently found that at one point, only 12% of Americans viewed press as credible. This level of erosion in the credibility of news media poses a significant problem when we are faced with to deal a global pandemic. Dissemination of accurate public health information and building a shared understanding of the risks are critically important to fight this pandemic. We are sadly observing that our understanding of this pandemic is fragmented and proven scientific facts are being lost in the midst of misinformation and conspiracy theories. So, what happened to news that was supposed to play a critical role in our society, holding the society together? We should take a glance at the history so that we can understand the present state of news. There were debates whether news should be treated as social good or a commodity like any other commodity in an open market capitalist economy. In the Western societies, the concept of news as a commodity prevailed, and news institutions flourished. This model later spread to the rest of the world, particularly in the developing societies, as the United States and other Western countries pushed for open market economy and deregulation. Institutions like the British Broadcasting Corporations was able to survive and still, provide news using an alternative model, but that's just one. In the US, in spite of all the cuts and attacks, PBS still exists, but again, it's just one example of that alternative model of news institutions beyond the open market capitalist model. So, what went wrong with the prevailing business model that treats news as a commodity like any other commodity? Hundreds of books have been written about it, and it is beyond the scope of this panel to discuss it fully. Newsrooms were squeezed to bare minimum to cut costs. Foreign bureaus were closed. Costly news operations such as investigative units discontinued. Local and regional newspapers either closed or sold to big businesses that consolidated their operations. The whole model left most US small towns with no or just one single newspaper, creating what we call news desert. According to UNC Chapel Hill's Hussman School of Journalism and Media, which recently conducted a study on this topic, news desert is a community, either rural or urban, with limited access to the sort of credible and comprehensive news and information that feeds democracy at the grassroots level. According to this study, in the US, 200 counties do not have a local newspaper. Half of US counties have only one newspaper, usually a weekly. A phenomenon referred to as infotainment in the scholarly literature helps news executive to produce news cheap. Infotainment is the practice of blending news with entertainment that prefers trivia and style over substance and significance. So if you watch cable news, I'm positive that you will see plenty of examples of infotainment in their operations. So to sum up, COVID-19 pandemic has exposed many ills of American society, such as income and health disparity. This pandemic has also exposed how information poor we are, and it is hurting us as we are dealing with this global pandemic. The question is what to do about this. I think one answer would be to strengthen liberal arts education, hoping that eventually it will contribute to citizen engagement and perhaps will create an environment where we can engage with one another. Facts can receive its value, and a more, what Dr. Paul said, that a more robust public sphere can be created. So with that, I want to conclude. Thank you for listening. Looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Rahman. Again, just a quick reminder, you can start typing in your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, so you can start doing that. Our next speaker is Professor David Carlson. He is professor and chair of the Department of English. Professor Carlson is the author of Sovereign Selves, American Indian Autobiography and the Law, published by University of Illinois Press, and Imagining Sovereignty, Self-Determination in American Indian Law and Literature by Oklahoma University Press, among many, many other publications. Dr. Carlson's teaching interests include Native American and Indigenous literatures, colonial and early American literature, and speculative fiction, particularly science fiction. So Professor Carlson.
Thanks, Paristu. And I think after that introduction, I should probably sort of note, despite the fact that I publish in Indigenous literatures, I'm not going to talk about Indigenous literatures today. I'm going to talk about speculative fiction a little bit. And I'm going to underplay, I think, I'm going to not be emphasizing as much as my other colleagues, I think, some of the limitations that COVID places on us in our fields, which isn't to say that teaching literature is not harder over Zoom and in a time of pandemic, but I think certainly my colleagues in art and music have different challenges than I have. So yes, and I'm going to talk about a novel today briefly. I want to say a few words about the 1954 post-apocalyptic horror novel, I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, which has also been adapted into 3 films. 1964's The Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price. 1971's The Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston, and Will Smith's 2007 I Am Legend. This is a book that I reread this summer as I'm incorporating it into my daughter's homeschool English curriculum for this year. So there's another nod to how COVID impacts us. When reading it in the context of COVID, though, I was struck by how resonant it was. And that resonance served as a very simple reminder to me of something I've always felt. Literary studies are always relevant and vital, and COVID has not changed that, for me at least. In many ways, in fact, I feel that COVID has only made me feel more strongly that the work my colleagues and I do as educators offers important and intellectual and emotional resources or patterns of thinking and feeling, if I can rob a little bit from Raymond Williams, for whatever challenges are before us. Since most of you won't know Matheson's novel, I want to give you a brief plot summary. And indeed, I think by itself, that summary will make a strong implicit argument regarding why reading literature matters, particularly in our present moment. So here's the story. Robert Neville is the sole survivor of a pandemic that has killed most of the world's human population and turned the remainder into vampires. The novel details Neville's life after the outbreak as he attempts to comprehend and possibly cure the disease. Swarms of vampires surround his house nightly and try to find ways to get inside. Weekly dust storms ravage the city, and during the day, when the vampires are inactive, Neville drives around to search them out in order to kill them with wooden stakes and scavenge for supplies. After bouts of depression and alcoholism, Neville determines that there must be some scientific reasons behind the vampire's origins, behaviors, and aversions, so he sets out to investigate. Through gradual research, he discovers that the root of the disease is a strain of bacteria, probably mutated by nuclear testing. This is a 1950s novel, capable of infecting both diseased and living hosts. Both deceased and living hosts. Drawing on his new knowledge, he's able to kill large numbers of vampires in his daily forays, so much so that his nightly visitors diminish significantly. But the inconsistency of Neville's results in handling vampires also leads him to realize that there are in fact 2 differently reacting types of plague victims. There are those who are conscious and living with a worsening infection, and there are those who have died but are reanimated by the bacteria. So we have the living vampires and the undead vampires. After 3 years, Neville meets a terrified woman in broad daylight. And he wants to know if this woman named Ruth is infected or immune, vowing to treat her if she is infected. She reluctantly allows him to take a blood sample, but she knocks him unconscious as he views the results. When he wakes up, he discovers a note from Ruth confessing that she is indeed a vampire sent to spy on him, and noting that he was responsible for the death of her husband, another vampire. The note further suggests that only the undead vampires are pathologically violent, but not those who were alive at the time of the infection and who still survive due to chance mutations of the bacteria. These living infected have slowly overcome the disease and are attempting to build a new society. They've developed medication that diminishes the worst of their symptoms. Ruth warns Neville that her people will attempt to capture him and that he should try to escape the city. However, assuming he will be treated fairly by this new society, Neville stays at his house until these living vampires arrive. Realizing then that his attackers may intend to kill him after all, he fires on them and is in turn shot and captured. Fatally wounded, he's placed in a barred cell where he is visited by Ruth, who informs him that she is a senior member of the new society. After discussing the effects of Neville's vampire killing activities on this new society, Ruth acknowledges the public need for Neville's execution. But out of mercy, she gives him a packet of cyanide pills. Neville goes to his prison window and sees the infected staring back at him with the same hatred and fear he once felt for them. He recognizes that their desire to kill him after he has killed so many of their loved ones is something he cannot condemn. As the pills take effect and he dies, he reflects on how he will now become their superstition and legend, just as vampires once were to humans. So I think, as you can tell from this summary, I Am Legend is a number of things. It's a work of apocalyptic fiction, building on the last man trope that dates back into the Gothic tradition, back to Mary Shelley. It's a book that reworks key elements of survivalist discourse, which in its own way is an interrogation of many of the fundamental assumptions of Western individualistic subjectivity. You can think of a book like Robinson Crusoe as a starting point to that tradition. It's a plague outbreak narrative, and that's a form with a long heritage dating back centuries. It's a vampire novel. It's arguably one of the first zombie novels. And as such, it's a work with deep political resonance and multiple levels of social commentary. But it's also a book about what isolation and depression feels like, and about their effects on the human psyche. A lot of what Neville goes through and a lot of his behaviors are driven by those psychological strains. In this respect, the book compellingly depicts how, confronted by the psychological strain triggered by a pandemic, Robert Neville's seemingly rational survival strategies turn him into the very kind of monster he sees himself as opposing. Thinking it the only way to save himself, he turns on others. And this certainly strikes me as useful commentary on some of what we see in our own society today. I don't want to naively overstate the power of literature to make us better human beings. I don't want to suggest that reading widely and well automatically makes us empathetic or wise or thoughtful. But I've always believed that reading well gives us a chance to be those things. Stories are a form of thinking and problem solving, and a way to negotiate the structures of communities and the place of ourselves in those communities. While also being a source of entertainment and aesthetic pleasure then, I know that I Am Legend has helped me and my 14-year-old daughter process some of the emotions and anxieties we felt over the past few months. It has given us a mediated way, or to borrow a term from Freud, perhaps a displaced way to talk about some of these things. Having devoted my career to writing, reading, thinking, and teaching about literature, I don't find it all surprising that this work of imaginative writing has allowed me to better see the mixture of irrationality and rationality, fear and anger, compassion and violence that is our society today, intensified by COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Carlson. Our next speaker is Professor Stacy Fraser. Stacy Fraser is professor and chair of music. Dr. Fraser's eclectic musical interests have led her to sing on international operatic, concert, and theater stages across the United States, Canada, Asia, and Europe. Professor Fraser's recent credits include the title role in Miss Donna Thorne's Maggot by Peter Maxwell Davies and the starring role in a musical art film entitled Still Life After Death by Sandra Powers. Professor Fraser is the director-producer of the first university production of Einstein on the Beach for Cal State University, San Bernardino. Dr. Fraser.
Thank you. As many of you know, the arts have taken a major hit during this current pandemic. Artists across the world have lost their jobs, their healthcare, and to a great extent, their own identity and self-worth. They have been told that they are non-essential workers, yet platforms like Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, the Disney Channel, YouTube, and countless others are what many of us have used to create a diversion from our own troubles, worries, and for some, actual boredom during this difficult and unprecedented time. Many of my friends here in the LA area have had zero income since the middle of March and have had to take jobs outside what they have been trained to do in order to survive. These are people who are highly educated with advanced degrees, many of whom have won prestigious awards as artists, musicians, designers, technicians, and scholars. Because our artistic disciplines in many ways define us as human beings, we are finding ways to continue despite the current challenges. My friend Jack Van Zandt is working harder than ever to be productive in our current climate. He states the following in a recent article published by Composers Edition UK, open quote, "For composers, social isolation and days on end working at home are pretty much standard operating procedure, so the situation is not that different for us now. But, like everyone else, many of us who depend on teaching gigs and master classes, performance royalties, TV and film production work, and new commissions for livelihoods are finding ourselves without any of our usual income. Even with all of this, luckily, I have been busier than ever with new projects. We musicians locked down in our homes are looking for new ways to get our work out to an audience locked down in their homes. And many composers are forming new partnerships and collaborations with performers and other composers all over the world. There are fundamental changes in progress that will alter how we practice our art now and in the future. The live concert hall experience may not die completely, but I think it is going to be largely replaced by other modes of performance that rely on technology and our ability to make music across all boundaries of physical time and space." Jack is an LA composer whose music is greatly influenced by physical science, astronomy, and mathematics, as well as the history of science. Today, I will present his work Aether, a multimedia work originally composed for performance in a traditional concert hall that has been re-envisioned and adapted for streaming platforms such as YouTube and Vimeo. Composers Edition UK states the following: "Describing the Aether in music was one that was most special to the composer personally because of his lifelong interest in flight and space travel, and everything to do with the study of the cosmos. In composing Aether, Van Zandt aimed to create a musical space and context that had the qualities of the element, including the spiritual aspect. This was accomplished by designing music that lent itself to being processed by electronic means in a live concert performance in order to place it in a multidimensional space. The piece features UK-based violist Carmen Flores and the work of UK videographer Tim Basford to create a multimedia artwork. The music for Aether is for solo viola with electronic effects chain that is designed to create a special sound world." I'm just going to say that again, there's a lot of words. The music for Aether is for solo viola with an electronic effects chain that is designed to create a special sound world. The music track was made by Flores, recording the viola part in her own UK home studio, and then processed by the composer in his Los Angeles studio. So for all practical purposes, it is akin to a live recording. Van Zandt and Flores were thrilled with the results of the recording and turned it over to Basford, who added the exciting visual dimension to make Aether a completely new and unique audience experience. The work premiered on August 5th at 9:30 p.m. UK time and 1:30 p.m. here in LA. The video is now available on the usual YouTube demand streaming platform. So what I want to do, I know there won't be time to show you the whole piece. It's 8 minutes long, but maybe we could have time for 4 minutes of it. It's best experienced in the dark with good speakers. So I don't know if anybody can immediately put themselves in the dark and turn up the volume, but that would be the ideal experience. Okay, so let me share here. Okay, here we go. So that concludes my part of the presentation for today. Thank you, Dr. Chuan, for inviting us to present today, and Dr. Fayez for hosting.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Our next presenter is Dr. Bill Vanderburg. He's a full professor in the Department of Philosophy. His research and teaching interests are broad, spanning the history and philosophy of the physical sciences to philosophy of religion, ethics, and the history of philosophy. The theme that ties his work together is reasoning about evidence. Professor Vanderburg's 2019 book, David Hume on miracles, evidence, and probability, will appear in paperback in December of this year. Congratulations. So, Professor Vanderburg.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. All right, is it working? I can't quite tell from where I am.
Yes.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So Pete Robertshaw, my chair, asked me to take his seat on this panel since he is an anthropologist rather than a philosopher. I'm happy to step in, though I am at a disadvantage in not having been there when the dean and the chairs were around the table formulating the plans for this session. So I hope I understood the brief properly. I'm also at a disadvantage because philosophy covers a huge amount of intellectual territory, and no one philosopher can fairly represent the whole of it. Instead of trying to do that, I'll try to give you a flavor of some of the ideas that philosophy might try to contribute in these times we find ourselves in, with the caveat that these are not all the ways that philosophy bears on these issues, nor even the ones that any other philosopher might have identified. Moreover, I'm an expert in a fairly small area of philosophy. I don't know anything, for example, about continental philosophy, let alone about other traditions and other cultures. So I'm not going to be trying to represent all of that. So one thing I'd like to do is just share with you that philosophy is generally broken down into 4 categories. We describe philosophy as having 4 branches: logic, epistemology, metaphysics, and value theory. You're probably familiar with those, but logic is the study of reasoning, epistemology is the study of the conditions of knowledge, metaphysics is the study of what exists, and value theory covers topics such as ethics, social political philosophy, aesthetics, and other areas. But there are lots of subfields of philosophy too, and some of them are listed here. There's a lot more of them, but what makes them particularly philosophical is that they try to take some of the tools and techniques from the 4 main branches of philosophy and apply them to specific problems. So how do we get to each of those kinds of subfields? Well, they say that philosophy begins in wonder, and then whatever the topic area is, we ask or we wonder when someone makes a claim, what does that claim mean and why should I believe it? So that first question is a request for clarification, and the second one is a request for justification, and those are the main tools of philosophy. Now you might say that every field of philosophy, or every field of intellectual endeavor rather, does a similar sort of thing, but perhaps what makes philosophy distinctive is that we do it in a way that's especially rigorous. So then for any topic that you might think of, X, there's a philosophy of X. So what about the philosophy of pandemics? Here, by the way, is a photograph I took in La Jolla. Some UCSD students were trying to social distance at the beginning of the pandemic. I thought it was a rather nice scene. I like to imagine that they were talking about philosophy, but I'm not really sure that was the case. So what might be involved in a field that isn't yet developed called the philosophy of pandemics? Well, it could include these sorts of considerations, probably lots of other ones too. But I think that some of these are pretty interesting. If you wanted to study ethics of public health orders, for example, you would have to get into issues like how do we balance personal freedom versus public safety? What do we do about people who are non-conforming? How do we ethically try to get them to conform to the public health order and that sort of thing? There's also ethics involved in treatment decisions, and I'll say something about that in just a moment. I think that one way that philosophy could really contribute to this environment, not just with regard to the pandemic, but with a lot of the things that are going on in our society today, would be to try to combat conspiracy thinking and science denialism. Some of you are aware that we have a new course in our department called Truth, Lies, and Bullshit, and it's been a massive enrollment success for us. So we'll see how the students like it at the end of this semester. But I think there's some hunger out there for coming up with ways to try to combat these sorts of conspiracy and denialism. Now, there is some work already being done along these lines by philosophers. I was really impressed that Ben Bramble from, I think he's from Melbourne, somewhere in Australia, published this book, Pandemic Ethics, 8 Big Questions of COVID-19, really quickly after the pandemic started. He must have been working on something similar and just pushed it all together. But anyway, this work is happening to some extent. This is an interesting sort of case of philosophy as it's happening, or the philosophy of an event while it's happening. However, so far, the philosophy of pandemics isn't a field, or at least it's fairly disconnected. Different people are doing different things in different places. All right, well, let's talk specifically about one of these areas, the ethics of lockdowns, just to try to get a flavor for what philosophers might do with regard to these kinds of questions. Now, some people have objected to lockdowns and even to mask requirements on the grounds that it's a severe restriction of personal freedom. And it is, but of course, that's not the only thing that matters. There's a trade-off at the societal level between inconveniences for some and death for others. And governments have a responsibility to minimize harms and maximize benefits for all. And so if the anti-maskers' claim is that they should not have to sacrifice for other people, then the answer to that is that, well, if you want to live in a society, you need to act like it. You need to do what's for the collective good. And other people shouldn't have to die just because you don't want to be inconvenienced. Triaging of limited medical resources is another area that philosophy can contribute in the current era. We have a great need, a need that exceeds our limited resources, and those resources are of all kinds, including materials, time, staff, beds, ventilators, drugs, and money, and so on. And in those circumstances, health professionals need to make decisions about who to treat, how to treat them, and so on. Now, bioethicists argue that such decisions should be made with an eye to justice. And this can involve making hard choices. For example, not to treat someone who's unlikely to survive, so that we can treat others who are likely to survive. Philosophical ethics provides tools for navigating conflicts between these kinds of duties, the duty to preserve life and the duty to maximize the good. And perhaps we can use those tools then once we've figured out some cases, to try to apply them to other harder cases. By the way, I think we're about to hit a really interesting example of triage and rationing when the vaccine becomes available, presumably within the next year or so. One of the things we'll have to try to figure out is who gets it first. And that's not going to be an easy thing to figure out, partly because we'll want to take account of justice issues, as well as the effectiveness of the way in which we roll out the vaccine. Sorry, I just realized that I've not been sharing my screen for you, or maybe you've seen some of this, but anyway, here we go. So there's the great need that needs to be met with limited resources. I think the best thing to do is to slowly chip away using the tools of philosophy and other areas that are available to us as best we can. And it's not obvious that we'll get to the end, but maybe we will. And I hope we get through it to the other side. And then hopefully after some much needed rest, we can all begin to theorize about what it means. In the hope, I think, of creating better systems for next time. And I think there will be a next time, at least if this isn't the beginning of the collapse of human civilization. And there's no question that that's a possibility, I think. My grandmother used to like to say that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But in fact, sometimes what doesn't kill you just weakens you, so that the next thing that wouldn't have killed you otherwise doesn't in fact kill you, right? So we might be in that unfortunate situation, and we'll need to try to have our eyes open as we attempt to navigate these difficult issues. Now, Socrates would have told us that the unexamined life is not worth living. And maybe that's one of the things that the interested public can get from philosophy in the pandemic era, is that we should be thinking carefully about how we're living and why we're doing the things that we're doing, so that we can get the maximum value out of it. But I think one of the big problems is that people aren't really listening right now. For one thing, we're all at maximum capacity. There's very little that we can add to our plates at the moment, let alone trying to figure out big sort of system level, structural level, philosophical problems. But on top of that, many of the people who are sort of in the way of doing the right thing, denialists and conspiracists, they make a point of saying that experts aren't worth listening to. right? You've probably heard that my opinion is just as good as yours and the experts don't matter. And so I think that we're going to have to deal with that problem. And I don't see an easy solution to it. In fact, it seems to me that it's probably going to be a generational problem, one that we need to try to solve over a very long period of time. But one thing that I think is perhaps valuable to us in the pandemic era is that we're essentially in a practice run for the climate crisis. We can see now that careful evidence-based reasoning and thoughtful collective action can actually contribute to the public good. It's not at all clear that we're doing that right now, but maybe we're going to see the value of it by the time this is over, and we'll be able to do more for the climate crisis, which, by the way, is going to be much worse. So if we are nearing the collapse of civilization, maybe there are some ethical issues that we need to consider, including this one, right? Is it ethical to have children under the current circumstances? And there have been several books that have been written on that topic, not recently, but in the last decade or so, that would certainly be relevant now with the emergencies that are coming in the near future. Maybe it's not the right thing to do to put other people into the world who are going to have to suffer and perhaps have terrible lives because of the things that we've been doing. Well, we might hope to find some value in all of this, in these catastrophes. And philosophers of war and disaster would have a lot more to say about this than I do. But given my own background in philosophy of science, something strikes me, and that is that this universe is absolutely chock full of stars and galaxies. This is the Hubble Deep Field from 2012. It's an image that's taken of the very deepest sky. It's about a third of the full moon wide, and it contains 10,000 galaxies. So I think it's a really special picture. Astronomers tell us that there are 2 times 10 to the 23 stars in the universe. That's 200 billion trillion stars. And that's an awful lot of stars. And one thing that I think we might be able to, some comfort we might be able to get from this is that, it probably just doesn't matter, right? That if we're failing at solving the COVID crisis and we're all dying, like the philosopher Bill Murray said in the 1979 movie Meatballs, it just doesn't matter. We're not even a cosmic afterthought, right? So maybe we shouldn't stress ourselves so much. Maybe we should just try to go on with our lives the best we can and try to be happy, even though things are terrible. Well, on the other hand, maybe it does matter. After all, with all those billions and billions and billions of stars out there, our planet is the only one that we know of where pain and suffering, joy and sadness are even possible. And that strikes me as something that's important, something that we should try to protect. After all the value that exists in the universe is value that we make together. So perhaps that's the lesson that we can take from all of this. And if we start to take this sort of perspective, maybe we'll have a better chance of tackling our next crisis. That's all I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk, Bill. Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Terry Donovan Smith. He is professor and chair of the Department of Theater Arts. Professor Smith has spent his life as an actor, director, and educator. He is a member of the Screen Actors Guild and Actors Equity, which is the Stage Actors Union, and has performed in feature films on professional stages and on television. Professor Smith holds a PhD in theater history and critical theory from the University of Washington School of Drama. So, Professor Smith.
Hi. So I'm gonna wail, but I have to read so I can get this done in time, right? Rome fell in 476 of the current era, and theater, which had been a staple of the Western world for over 1,000 years, fell with it. The end. Wait. No. Okay, maybe it's not. We don't know much about the next 500 years or so, except that there was a volcanic eruption in Iceland that covered much of Europe with ash for 18 months. This happened in 536. And the plague of Justinian killed as many as 100 million people between 541 and 549. Does this sound familiar at all? So theater was done. Nothing to see here. These aren't the shows you're looking for. Move along. And yet, in the year 1000, a tradition of itinerant performers, storytellers who sang and danced, was alive in Europe. We have contemporary illustrations from French manuscripts. I'll do a quick screen share here. And bang, bang. Okay. So this is from a French manuscript right around the year 1000. They were called jongleurs. They usually worked alone and traveled from town to town, court to court, entertaining any who could pay, and sometimes just those who could feed them. So where did these folks come from? Did somebody just wake up one day and say, I think I'm going to play the lute? Wait, what's a lute? No, I have always believed that what we used to call the Dark Ages were only dark because we can't see into it. Performers kept doing what they knew, kept passing down skills and insights from generation to generation. So which brings us to today. You see, you can't stop us. It's a compulsion, an addiction, but we don't do it for just ourselves. Well, some people do just for themselves. We need spectators. No matter the Greek audiences had 17,000 people in them and Roman audiences were up to 25,000, we can do it for just one. Many have asked the question, and actually today, what has sustained us during this most difficult of times? Books, absolutely, but not sports. Even now that they're back, sort of, the crowd noises are canned like a bad sitcom. Not the news, as Shafiq has pointed out, and for pity's sake, not the debates. No. It's been performers, actors, musicians, dancers, singers, comedians, drama students, performance artists, people slipping on ice. It's been great clowns and aspiring talents. Some with really, really good technology, some with just a camera. Almost all of them alone, trying to touch us, to make us smile. Creativity finds a way. You can't stop us, and you really wouldn't want to. So here are a few examples. Hold on. Here we go.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, okay. Okay. So how have you been? Oh, dumb question. What a dumb question.
No, that's not a dumb question. How have you been?
Well, I had a scratchy throat for a while there. And of course you think, oh my God. But you know, I think you're frozen. I don't know how to fix this. You're frozen. Can you hear me?
What?
There you are. You're frozen. Yeah. Anyway, I had this scratchy throat.
How's your wife?
Oh, she's fine. She's sitting Shiva in the living room.
Oh.
Zoom Shiva, but since she starts her Zoom yoga, she wanted me to do some Zoom Zumba with her, but I told her, honey, I'm too busy, you know.
Hi, people. The Princess Buttercup.
Your grandfather's here.
What is it? The Princess Bride. As you wish.
What is this? Is this a kissing story?
Keep your shirt on. Let me read. I did not hire you for your brains, you hippopotamic landmass. My father's...
Hold it, Grandpa. She marries Leslie. I'm sure of it.
Yes, you're very smart. Shut up. Smart.
What's the matter?
They're kissing again.
I don't understand.
Jesus, Grandpa, what did you read me this thing for?
I can stop now, if you want.
No, you can read a little bit more.
He has very good arms.
I don't think you would accept my help since I am just waiting around to kill you.
That does put a damper on our relationship.
Who are you?
No one of consequence.
Okay.
Can you come over tomorrow and read it again? As you wish.
And that is all I have today.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor George Thomas. He is chair of the Department of World Languages and Literatures. Dr. Thomas is a specialist in colonial Latin American literature and culture. His research interests include gender, women's studies, and indigenous studies. His first book, published by Routledge, examines the political aesthetics of the colonial Mexican nun, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, the first feminist of the Americas. So, Professor Thomas.
Thank you for the introduction. And I'm going to focus on monastic life in the cloister because much of my research has focused on nuns that write in the 16th and 17th century. And I think that this is also an opportunity to kind of reflect on the past, to gain perspective, and to learn from the lessons from literature in the past. I came here from Colorado, and right as the COVID outbreak started, I was studying Sor Juana in one of my classes, and we were actually watching the movie about her life, which is called I, the Worst of All. And we had gotten to this scene, coincidentally, where Sor Juana and the nuns actually get sick because Sor Juana actually died during a pandemic. It was an outbreak of either cholera or typhus. And so she died in 1695, and there are varying reports of how many other nuns died in her convent. And at the time I kept thinking, oh, I should make a connection and this is a teachable moment, but I couldn't think of really anything to say because I was kind of in shock. And then the next day classes were canceled and we went on spring break, and then we never came back to class for the semester in Colorado. So I'm glad for this opportunity to finally make a good connection. And the connection is not about pandemics in the 16th and 17th century, which were fairly common. but about what is a cloistered life and how that relates to the current lockdown. I think a part of the problem that we have is we have terms like lockdown, which are negative, or stay-at-home orders, which are negative. And so I'm going to just talk briefly about 3 different writers who were either nuns or friars, and how the cloistered life and ideas in their writing can relate to the present reality. Many people probably don't know what a cloistered life is, but in the 16th or 17th century, many men or women elected to lead a religious life in a convent or a monastery. And in all convents for women, this was the truth, that you had to make a vow to live in clausura, or cloister, which meant that once you entered the convent, you had to stay there until the end of your life. So even though the current lockdown seems pretty strict, in the past, people elected to live this kind of life. So why would they want to live this kind of life, and what are some of the lessons we can learn from them? And what are some of the things we see now that are similar to life in a convent or monastery, since we all have this monastic life? And so I'll use this kind of lockdown that we're living now as kind of a modern type of cloister. And so what are some of the things that that we can learn from these writers? The first one is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who was a cloistered nun in 17th century Mexico. And I think from her work, we can learn that the cloistered life can be an intellectual opportunity and an opportunity to work on artistic and literary pursuits. So Sor Juana entered into the convent. She was able to publish poetry and plays. She was able to write music. We know that she wrote a book on music theater. And so the convent, as a private space outside of the public world, gave her the opportunity to do this. Now, as we've seen in some of the other panelists' presentations, if you're a professional artist or musician, the cloister or lockdown is really affecting your ability to interact with the public or make money. And most nuns did not make money off of their music or their writing, but they viewed it as a time to focus on that work. So maybe we can think of that as an opportunity to focus on their work, or to find alternative ways, as we saw in the YouTube videos or in the postings of music and art, alternative ways to diffuse that work even while living in the cloister. And I also see this in terms of people focusing on like cooking, which was another popular art in convents, you know, perfecting your sourdough bread, etc. These are things that we can benefit from during this temporary cloister. The second idea is the cloistered life as an opportunity for meditation and mindfulness. And this was the main idea for most people to enter into a cloister in the 16th and 17th century. And in relation to this, I'd like to focus on the 16th century Spanish writer, Saint Teresa of Avila. And I know she would want me to tell you that you should spend this time praying and getting closer to God, but I know that most people are more secular. And so I think other opportunities that we can think of in terms of this current cloister can range from things that I've seen. For example, I have a lot of friends who have been doing the Marie Kondo method and cleaning up all of the clutter in their house as a way of also simultaneously cleaning up all the clutter in your life, or entering into other types of meditation or mindfulness in order to gain a better perspective and peace. I know students always, when I teach Saint Teresa's writing, they're surprised that they find it very relaxing, because she always talks about trying to not be fearful about life and not be afraid, and to find a certain peace, which she associates with the connection with God. But I think we can associate that with other things in the present context. The third opportunity that's possible in the cloister is the cloister is a way to reject materialism and connect with nature. And this I would connect to the writings of the 16th century friar Luis de Leon, who's most famous for his poem called La Vida Retirada, or the Life Removed. And in this poem, Friar Luis, who was an Augustinian friar, he talks about how one should reject the city and society and striving to just make money and spend money and live a retired life in the country and connect to nature. And I think this is one of the few opportunities that we can have now, given that, you know, we're not using our cars more and we're almost living a more environmentally friendly type of life. We're living a life that is more connected to nature. I know that my parents and my sisters, for example, have spent a lot of time building bird houses and building little picnic tables for squirrels and then posting the pictures of the birds and the squirrels visiting them. So this is an opportunity to connect to nature and to not be as consumers and connect more with an environmental message, which is Fray Luis's message. And I think that that's one thing that perhaps will change the way we live in the post-COVID era for the better. So in closing, I do want to say, and hopefully my message doesn't sound like a public service announcement, but I am afraid that most people at this juncture, when we're kind of at exhaustion with the lockdown and staying at home, that people are going to then enter the public sphere more, and then we're just going to have this spike of cases, etc. So I think it's also important to remember that this cloister we're living is just temporary, and it's not going to last a lifetime, as it was for many nuns. In fact, one of the things that I find amazing is that many nuns, although Sor Juana died when she was in her 40s, so she didn't spend that much time in her cloister, many nuns spent more than 50 years cloistered in a convent and died there. But for most of us, this will only last until the vaccine or cure is discovered. So I think that would only be hopefully a few more months. And until then, we can think of these writings from the past and the cloistered lives of these nuns and monks as one way to sort of negotiate the current reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So our last speaker is Professor Kelly Dortch, an artist, educator, and advocate. Professor Kelly Dortch currently serves as the Liberal Studies Program Coordinator at CSUSB. Prior to this appointment, Professor Dortch has served in the English department at CSUSB, as well as in other educational venues, healthcare, and various other industries. She's a member of the International Association on Research for Service, Learning, and Community Engagement, and the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education. Professor Dortch. Is she here?
I am. I moved my screen over so I could.
Okay, sorry.
I lost the microphone and I couldn't slide it over because I'm nervous and my hands are shaking. So here I am. So anyway, so thank you, Dean Chuang, Associate Dean Fays, chairs, colleagues, for sharing your time and expertise and passions with us today. So far today, we've heard discussions about how the arts and humanities sustain us and give meaning to our existences. And especially how we process our existence and experiences through the pandemic. I would propose that nowhere is this more important and critical than within liberal studies, where the main focus of my position is to help prepare liberal studies as emerging educators to assume their roles within their own classrooms by assisting them to gather up the various disciplinary threads that they're exposed to so that they can braid a single rope with which to hoist themselves and their students to greater evolutions of understanding, as they not just teach children, but they build adults through teaching children. So traditionally speaking, education is a communal, rhetorical, and transformational process for humans, with humans, by humans. In fact, when faced with the hope and challenges of looking forward, I'm often reminded of the words of my mentor who said, we must remember that we became educators because we believe that people can change. Even in this statement, the focus is on people, it's on humans. So the focus of my presentation will be on how to keep the human in the arts and humanities during the age of pandemics. Not a singular pandemic, but pandemics, and I'll touch upon that later. So in our primary classrooms, we often learn what things are called, what they are named. It's not until we evolve sometime later that we realize that the act of naming is a rhetorical act that, as far as we know, is only undertaken by humans. In order for naming to occur, there must be reflection. In order for reflection to be expressed, there must be a word. In order for the word to have meaning, there must be agreement. And in order for there to be agreement, there must be some sort of action to lend a sense of physicality. Otherwise, the reflection remains transient and the word is only a staticky blah, blah, blah. In order for the word and the reflection to become action, there must be a completion of a circuit, the human circuit of being. So how do we complete the human circuit of being? In his seminal work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire writes, quote, "To exist humanly is to name the world, to change it. Human beings are not built in silence, but in word, in work, in action, and reflection. To transform the world is not a privilege of some, but the right of everyone, and it must not be done by some for others through prescriptive acts," end quote. Therefore, true transformation, the act of being human, of naming, of changing, only occurs through the co-engagement of words, reflection, and action. In other words, through dialogue. And dialogue, by its very definition, can only occur where there is a willingness to be transformed not by others or for others, but with others. For only by agreeing to be transformed with others does naming in and of itself become a communal act and not a prescriptive act or a banking model depository act. And only by engaging in communal acts such as dialogue can we manifest the transformation that defines the achievement and significance of being human. And only by continuing to advance the arts and humanities as showcases of creativity, culture, refinement, and enlightenment can we continue to name, to define, to change, to transform our world and our experiences within our world, and the very art of being human and the completing of the human circuit of being. So how can we leverage dialogue to keep the human in the humanities during the age of paradoxical pandemics, where one, the viral pandemic, forces our physical separation and distancing, and where another, the racism pandemic, cries out for even greater communal connections and deeper, more piercing levels of dialogue? How do we do it? We prep our pantries. For there is no more communal act than that of dining together. Consider the following: eating the same food from the same pots, from the same plates, from the same bowls at the same time builds trust. Trust in eating together builds relationships and community. Trust in relationships and community and the preparation of food together creates culture. Trust, relationships, community, culture, and the growing of food creates a trans-diverse experience of all, for all, and with all that includes every kind of human, weather, soil, plant, animal, etc. Eating is the single greatest universal act of human being, and it is also the gateway to the greatest equalizer. We must all do it or we will die. So what does paradoxical pandemic pantry prep look like? Part of it looks like this, like virtual discussions and lectures and webinars and meetings. These serve as our new urban cultural centers, town squares, public houses, fellowship halls, and salons. But where's the food? Where's the wine and hors d'oeuvres at an art opening, or the dinner before a stage performance? Where's the beer after a poetry reading, or cupcakes for a third grade classroom birthday party? Where's the culinary tourism and learning about a culture through its food? Where's the communication and the philosophical debate and dialogue that can only happen around the table? Where is the reciprocal connection that completes the human circuit of being that happened to me when a Spanish-speaking mother from El Salvador gifted me with her homemade pupusa and cortito because I shared my time with her bilingual daughter? This exchange is representative of a with-based community whose value and currency are people, all people, and the sharing of their gifts, all of their gifts. This sort of community can only happen human face to human face, and it happens best and most often when we dine together, because then we are equals sharing a single moment of being. Moreover, during our time of being, we are physically consuming the gift of love and being in the moment with the act of loving. This can only happen when we can love. And we can only love when we can give. And we can only give if we have that which to give. This means keeping a full and well-stocked pantry of love during a time of pandemic fear, suspicion, and loss. And being in the arts and humanities means that we create, we give, we love. But to love, to give, to create, we must prep, but how? through our paradoxical pandemic pantry prep. This means assessing our needs, gathering our ingredients, getting our utensils ready, and supplementing what is lacking in our pantry in preparation for the time when we can reconvene and recommune post-viral pandemic to name and change and transform our racism pandemic infected world. It means digging up recipes of our own lived experiences and old family recipes of historical experience. It means throwing open the cupboards and seeing which shelves are bare and which are overstocked, and putting all of the ingredients on the table to see what we're working with and what we're missing and what we're lacking. It means menu planning. What is the purpose of this meal? And what are we hungry for? Who are we feeding? It means securing the missing ingredients to both complete the menu and add our own spice to the old recipes to make them our own. It means creating dishes, and it means mentoring one another and passing down the lessons we've learned to the next generation, like how to tell if the masa is too dry, the milk is about to sour, or how to measure salt in the palm of your hand. It means having the talk with our Black and brown children before we even allow them out into the world. It's about having sufficient seating so there's room for everyone at the main table. It's about embracing diverse table manners. Are we eating family style tonight? With our fingers? Are we feeding one another? If someone has a particular preference or life-threatening allergy, do we make something special for them? Alter the entire menu for everyone? Do nothing? Do we assume, or do we just ask what they prefer? While many of these decisions may be situational, paradoxical pandemic pantry prep is not. It is just like real food in the real world, where there are those among us with access to non-GMO, organic, fresh produce, the choice to be vegan or fruitarian, or to enjoy a juicy, thick, dry-aged steak dinner with all the trimmings, access to buffets and banquets and bounties. Similarly, just like in the real world, there are also those of us whose experience with being human is hunger, famine, and starvation. And all of the paradoxical pandemic pantry prep in the world can only take us so far if we don't also create an equitable experience for those who are relegated to the kids' table or who are hungry or starving. If everyone does not first have equitable access to technology, education, food, housing, civil liberties, and basic human respect and value, then everyone cannot achieve the full significance of being human by engaging with others in dialogue instead of being defined by the dialogues that are occurring about them and for them, but without them.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you all for such inspiring and thought-provoking talks. We have technically 1 minute, and we also have one question. If you have another question, I think we can go a few minutes over, if that's okay, and answer other questions that you might have. I'm going to read the question, see in the Q&A section. This is to all panelists. Do you see any unexpected benefits that the pandemic has provided to the humanities? If so, what are they? Would somebody like to jump in? Yes, Shafiq, I can see you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I did. I'm not necessarily to talk, but certainly, I mean, I see, fortunately, 3 members of our family were together. Our grown-up daughter who just finished her college, and, we're spending a whole lot of time together and understanding our privilege, and then just understand what family means to us. And then so many people are without family, and then sometimes I wonder that someone without a family, when that person goes back to his or her home, how it feels in this isolation. So it's a whole lot of empathy that's what we are experiencing, we're learning. So that's all from me.
Thank you.
Can I speak to that for just a moment? I alluded to it in my presentation. I think one of the advantages of the pandemic for arts and humanities is, for those that do have access to technology, now they have access to a whole new world of arts and humanities that they didn't necessarily have before. The internet, Zoom rooms, those sorts of immediate exchanges, they really are a virtual representation of the town hall, the fellowship hall, the urban cultural center, the pub, right? But then You know, similarly, we're excluding whole segments of our population, but for those that have access, it has opened up, you know, all new vistas for them.
That's right.
I'm
Yes.
going to try to talk over the answering machine that's going off on my house right now as I answer this. I guess I would say just really simply, the meaning of art is never fixed. It's always changed, amplified, supplemented by context. So I think, I don't know if you want to call this a benefit, but you know, just going back to the book, to the I Am Legend that I was talking about, that book means something different to me now than it did a few years ago when I taught it. And that's an addition. That's not a subtraction to me. That's an addition. I mean, again, I don't know that I would want to read it in the COVID context forever. But again, the first time I read this and when I've taught it in the past, I didn't think of it as much in terms of the psychological condition of the protagonist as I do now. And that's a new meaning. And I suspect all my colleagues who are talking about arts from other disciplines, other fields, would say something similar, right? That there's always new meaning being produced, regardless of our circumstances. And that's part of what we are as human beings. That's part of our creativity. And so that's always something important about us. And even a crisis moment can reveal that, I think. So.
Yes. Thank you, Dave. Anyone else would like to?
I was just going to add very quickly, Paris, if that's okay. In answer, sort of following Kelly's point, you know, I think that's an excellent point that for people who do have access to the internet, the resources that are available suddenly are amazing. I mean, just in terms of art and design alone, you know, museums have been relatively slowly adding their collections online, but the last 9 months has seen, you know, a great increase on that. There's more exhibitions online. There's just more to find online from reputable, you know, let's say edited or peer-reviewed sources. And I think, you know, that is really a benefit, just the acceleration of putting information online and making information accessible and improving the infrastructure to deliver that information more efficiently to people. So yeah, I mean, I was pretty negative in my talk about things like, you know, Instagram and Twitter, and Facebook, which, as we know, can become like echo chambers. But I think the access to resources that can expand people's horizons and expand people's chances for thinking differently are terrific now. It's really, really terrific. So that is an unexpected, the acceleration of that is an unexpected benefit to the arts and humanities.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I would like to just say a little something about that. You know, as great as it is that people like Jack Van Zandt are moving on, and it's not so different from what he does normally, you have to realize that the technology that he's using is very, very advanced and takes many, many hours of editing and coordination. So that's not always, I mean, most people don't have the same kind of access like we talked about to that kind of technology to put together something so polished. And for me, as a performer, I mean, I want to be in the room. I need to be with people in the same time, in the same space. So I found it particularly difficult, which many of you have already heard me say several times. But you know, I still practice every day, and thankfully I have my daughter. I can you know, work with her on different projects because she's a performer as well. But it's challenging.
Definitely. Thank you, Stacy. Other thoughts? Well, then with that, Dean Chung, I think we can close the, yes.
Yes, thank you all for joining our panel presentation. I want to thank our panelists for their very insightful, very thoroughly discussion, and also for all the audience who stay with us. I know we went over, but thank you all for attending our panel presentation. Thank you.